Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the 13th Right Livelihood lecture hosted by the University of Zurich. We cannot meet this year, but we can connect with each other. Thank you so much for being with us. With this year's lecture, we are celebrating Bryan Stevenson, who is sharing the award with Nazreen Sotoudeh, Alex Bialyatsky and Lottie Cunningham-Wren. Let me briefly take you through the program. We are very pleased and honored that the president of the University of Zurich, Michael Scapman, whose research priorities include, by the way, Earth observation to measure biodiversity from space, will open the lecture. The President's greetings are followed by a few words from Lorenz Hilty, Professor for Informatics and Sustainability Research. And he is Sustainability Delegate to the University, responsible for raising awareness, for networking and promoting sustainable management of resources, and, not the least, communicating within the university as well as with the media and the public. Subsequent to the greetings, we show a short video dedicated to all 4 laureates of this year 2020. I will then briefly introduce Bryan Stevenson, who does not really need an introduction. He is himself the best ambassador of his work, as you might know from his famous TED Talk, "We Need to Talk About Injustice." After Bryan Stevenson's lecture, we'll end our program with some closing remarks from Anne Rüffer, President of Right Livelihood Switzerland and member of the international jury responsible for selecting the recipients of the award. And now I hand over to Michael Scapman, followed by Lorenz Hilty.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, in front of your screens, at home, in your office or elsewhere. A warm welcome also from my side to the Right Livelihood Award Lecture 2020. I am particularly pleased to welcome this year's Right Livelihood Award laureate, Professor Bryan Stevenson. Congratulations. Bryan Stevenson is the founding member of the Equal Justice Initiative, whose main goals are to challenge poverty and racial injustice, advocating for equal treatment in the justice system, and creating hope for marginalised communities. The team of the Equal Justice Initiative hence works with marginalised communities, changing the narrative about race in America. The Right Livelihood Award has been awarded to Bryan Stevenson for his inspiring endeavour to reform the US criminal justice system and advance racial reconciliation in the face of historic trauma. It is of utmost importance that members of our civil society, like Bryan Stevenson, take action and share their experience and knowledge with us. The award not only provides an excellent opportunity to do so, it honors his enormous efforts challenging injustice and inequality in our society. Thank you very much, Bryan Stevenson, for doing so. The University of Zurich is most grateful for your work and achievements. You may ask yourselves, why the University of Zurich? The University of Zurich is the first university that was founded entirely on the will of the people and not on the will of a singular decisive authority. This is what makes us a perfect place to host the award. It is already the 13th time that the University of Zurich hosts the award. The first time was in 2008, when the world was in the middle of a financial crisis. Inequalities were not only financial at the time, but also legal, economic, and others, and they continued to be so. 12 years later, we are struggling with a global pandemic, hitting first and foremost underprivileged populations. In view of this year's laureate main focus, I like to emphasize the worsened conditions of detention during this pandemic. Scientific and media reports alike show that detention facilities face huge challenges in controlling the COVID-19 virus because of crowded, shared spaces. Inmates suffer from an even bigger physical and social distance than usual due to the stricter visiting rules, not only in Switzerland, but all over the world. Before I pass on the word to Lorenz Hilty, our sustainability delegate at the University of Zurich, I would like to briefly comment on the social responsibility of science in general and the University of Zurich in particular. Academic freedom calls for a high degree of responsibility. That includes reflecting on all ethical implications of our research activities. Autonomy, freedom of speech, and most importantly, a substantial fraction of value-free base funding allows us to keep our key values. We wish to transmit those values to our students and staff, ensuring that we remain committed to these values also after a university education or career. It is therefore the aim of the University of Zurich to provide an environment and culture that provides everyone with the courage to stand up for one's belief. Only with such an attitude we will be able to contribute to reducing poverty, inequality, and injustice. The University of Zurich actively engages in the dialogue with the general public. Exhibitions, public talks, or open lectures, like the one of tonight, are organized on a regular basis. The newly established Right Livelihood Center of the University of Zurich and the Center for Human Rights Studies, amongst others, act as hubs between the university and the public. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the Right Livelihood Foundation for choosing, as always, great candidates for their prize. We are grateful for the very successful cooperation with the foundation and wish to continue doing so. The University of Zurich community and our public audience are eager to get in closer contact with personalities such as Bryan Stevenson, even though it's in a virtual fashion this year. I wish you all an inspiring lecture, and I'm grateful to pass on the word to Lorenz Hilty.
A warm welcome from my side as well. This year's Right Livelihood Award laureate, Professor Bryan Stevenson, reminds us that some values and basic principles we may have taken for granted still need to be defended. Values and principles like equal treatment in the justice system of a Western democracy. In our privileged lives, we may have thought that the battle against racism has been won sometime in history, but we painfully became aware that this is still ongoing and will accompany us on the way to a better future, hopefully. This is the core idea, by the way, of sustainability, to keep our eyes open when things we have taken for granted turn out to be more fragile than you thought, or even eroding, things such as stable climate on Earth, such as the ecosystems in our environment that produce the air we are breathing every minute, and the democratic institutions that maintain the freedom to breathe this air. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations include goal number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. We cannot hope for sustainable development without peace, stability, human rights, and effective governance based on the rule of law. Thank you, Bryan Stevenson, for your endurance in contributing to this goal.
The following short video presents all 4 2020 award winners. Their commitment, their tireless fight for human rights and social as well as ecological justice demonstrates once again the impressive range of projects of the laureates supported by the Right Livelihood Foundation way beyond the award ceremony. The foundation provides its laureates with long-term support and helps them amplify the impact of their work. Bryan Stevenson is an American lawyer, social justice activist, founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, and a law professor at New York University School of Law. But he's based in Montgomery, Alabama, or one should rather say he's rooted in Montgomery, although he was born and raised in Delaware and educated at Eastern University and later Harvard. After his graduation, he moved south, first to Atlanta to join the Southern Center for Human Rights, and finally to Montgomery, where he is running a resource center and death penalty defense organization and initiated the National Memorial for Peace and Justice with the related Legacy Museum, dedicated to the history from enslavement to mass incarceration and its remembrance. Last year, the legal drama Just Mercy was released, a film based on Bryan Stevenson's memoir, Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption. Reading his book and listening to his public presentations, talks and interviews, 3 ideas, or rather concepts, always intrigue me. First, proximity, meaning don't stay away, don't run in the face of misery, poverty and injustice. Come close and share, even if it is only a little. Secondly, he says that the opposite of poverty is not wealth, but justice. This gives all of us an opportunity to do something, to stand up for justice wherever you are and whatever you are able to continue. And third, change needs hope, and it requires hope to create justice. Again, this relies to all of us. You don't have to be rich or powerful to be meaningful for your environment, your family, your community. And this is exactly what the Right Livelihood Award is about. And now please listen to Bryan Stevenson.
It's wonderful to be with all of you. It's a great privilege to be a part of the Right Livelihood community, and being named a laureate and getting to know more about the extraordinary work that the laureates are doing around the world has been a remarkable bright spot in an otherwise challenging year. This year has exposed so much inequality and injustice around the globe. My work has certainly been challenged by the issues the pandemic has revealed. But we're also living in a time when inequality and injustice is manifesting itself in new and challenging ways. I want to talk about my work through that lens. I am an attorney. I've spent the bulk of my career providing legal services to people on death row, people who have been wrongly convicted and unfairly sentenced. I am a product of a movement that used law to help disfavored people. I grew up in the segregated American South. As a child, we were excluded from the public schools. Black kids could not attend public schools. I started my education in a colored school. Racial segregation didn't provide educational opportunities to people like my dad. There were no high schools for Black kids in our county when my dad was a teenager. But then lawyers came into our community and implemented the Supreme Court decisions that struck down racial segregation in education. And because these lawyers got proximate to poor Black kids like me, I got to go to high school, I got to go to college, I went to law school, and I wanted to use that same power of the rule of law to protect other disfavored people. And that's what motivated me to do the work that I've been doing. And we continue to do that work of representing children and representing people who've been wrongly convicted and unfairly sentenced. In the United States, we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. This is one of the most punitive societies on the planet. Our prison population has grown from about 200,000 in 1972 to over 2.3 million today. Our country has 6 million people on probation or parole. There are 70 million Americans with criminal arrest histories, which means that when they try to get jobs or try to get loans, they're often disfavored by that history. And stunningly, at the beginning of this century, in 2001, our Bureau of Justice projected that 1 in 3 Black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison. And so the work of protecting vulnerable populations from this huge carceral apparatus has become a primary part of my career and work, and it continues to shape my work. But about a decade ago, I realized something about the limits of democracy, the limits of the rule of law in spaces that have been compromised by narratives of inequality and injustice. And what I realized is that our ability to get the law to protect the most vulnerable people, the most disfavored people, will not succeed if it's not accompanied by a narrative of equality and justice, a narrative that values human rights and human dignity. And that caused me to step out of the courts and begin working on the larger environment. I am now persuaded that we have to change narratives all across the globe where we see inequality and injustice. Narratives are the things that are underneath the policy debate. You hear people talking about climate change and talking about immigration and talking about a host of issues. But those conversations are oftentimes not really exposing the narratives that shape how people think and believe. And we have to understand these narratives, and we have to change the narratives that sustain inequality. In my country, we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world because we've been governed by a narrative of fear and anger. And I've seen this happen all across the globe. In this country, we've had a generation of politicians that have wanted the population to be afraid and angry. And when you allow yourself to be governed by fear and anger, you tolerate things you would not otherwise tolerate. You accept things that would otherwise be unacceptable. We decided about 50 years ago that people who were suffering from addiction, and drug dependency, we called those people criminals. And we decided to use the criminal justice system to respond to those problems. We didn't have to do that. We could have said that people suffering from addiction and dependency have a health problem, and we need a healthcare response. But that narrative of fear and anger pushed us into this direction. And if you go anywhere in the world where there's oppression or abuse or mistreatment or victimization of disfavored communities, if you ask the oppressors why they do what they do, they can give you a narrative of fear and anger. And so for me, changing these narratives of fear and anger has become central to creating environments where the rule of law and justice can prevail. In my country, it is this same thinking that has pushed me to want to change the narrative about race. In the United States, we live in a society that has been compromised, that has been corrupted by our long history of racial inequality. I actually don't think we are free in America. Whether you live in California or Florida or New Hampshire or New York or Alabama, you live in a space where the legacy of racial inequality has created a kind of smog. It's in the air. And it doesn't matter if you come here from Europe or come here from Asia or come here from any place in the world, you soon have to take in these toxins that have shaped this environment. And for a long time, elected officials and leaders have argued that these toxins will slowly dissipate and we'll get to this better place. And I'm now persuaded that that's not the way this works. These are not the kinds of pollutants, the kinds of contaminants that will simply dissipate. We're going to have to clean the environment to create the sort of pathway to equality and justice that many of us seek. And for me, that means talking about things that we haven't talked about before. And so for the last decade in my work, I've been trying to get our nation to confront the fact that we are a post-genocide society. I think what happened to Native people, to indigenous people, when Europeans came to this continent was a genocide. We killed millions of indigenous people through famine and war and disease. We slaughtered whole populations. We kept their words. Half of the states in America are actually native words, but we made the people leave. We created this constitution that's renowned across the globe for its emphasis on equality and justice for all, but we didn't apply those values, those concepts, to indigenous people who were being slaughtered. And the reason why we were able to make that disconnect is that we created a narrative of racial difference. We said that these native people, these indigenous people, they're different. They're racially different. And we use rhetoric. We said, oh, those people are savages. And that narrative of racial difference allowed us to be indifferent to their suffering and persecution. And it was that same narrative of racial difference that got us comfortable with 2.5 centuries of slavery. And I don't believe the great evil of American slavery was the involuntary servitude and the forced labor. I believe the real evil of slavery was the narrative we created to justify enslavement. Enslavers in this country didn't want to feel immoral. They didn't want to feel unjust, unchristian. And so they created this narrative, this myth about the Black people they were enslaved. And they persuaded themselves that Black people are not the same as white people. Black people are less human, less capable, less evolved, less deserving, less valuable. And that narrative of racial difference shaped and created an ideology of white supremacy. And that ideology of white supremacy was the real evil of American slavery. We fought a civil war in this country, and the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war because that idea of racial hierarchy, that idea of white supremacy persisted. And even after we passed the constitutional provision to abolish slavery, we didn't address this problem of racial hierarchy, this ideology of white supremacy. And as a result of that, in my country, slavery didn't really end in 1865, it just evolved. It turned into a century of racial violence and terrorism. For decades, Black people were pulled out of their homes. They were beaten, they were drowned, they were murdered, they were lynched, sometimes literally on the courthouse lawn. Our systems of law enforcement were insufficient to counter this mob violence that terrorized generations of Black people. And we have never really acknowledged this history. We have not confronted this history. And it was traumatizing. The demographic geography of the United States was shaped by racial terror. The Black people in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland, Minneapolis, New York, Boston, and the urban centers of America, the Black people in these communities did not go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went to those communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. Older people of color come up to me sometimes. They say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear someone talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. He said, we grew up with terror. We had to worry about being bombed and lynched and menaced every day of our lives. And we've never really acknowledged this narrative of trauma and violence, this terrorism. We had a heroic civil rights movement in this country in the 1950s and 60s. I am the heir to the courage of Black people who put on their Sunday best and went places to protest, pushing for equality and justice. And in response to those protests, they were beaten and they were battered and they were bloodied, and yet they went anyway. And as a result of that, we had some laws change, but this narrative of racial difference persisted. And today we are still living in a space where if you are Black or brown, you can be a gifted researcher, you can be a university professor, you can be a doctor, you can be a lawyer, you can be a teacher, a nurse, you can be a priest, you can be kind and loving. But if you're Black or brown, you will go places in this country where you're going to be presumed dangerous and guilty. And that presumption of dangerousness and guilt will create risks for you. It is the reason why police violence has been so traumatizing and provocative in communities of color, is because we live with the burden of this presumption of dangerousness and guilt. When I was a young lawyer, I graduated from Harvard Law School. I'd completed my studies. I was practicing in Atlanta, Georgia, and I came home late one night, having left my office, and I was sitting in my car, and they were just playing these songs on the radio I hadn't heard in a long time. So I took my time in getting out of the car and actually started looking at some of my papers to prepare for legal proceedings I was going to be doing the next day. And because I sat in my car a little longer than usual, and I just moved to this neighborhood, someone called the police. And these two police officers drove up to me, and they got out of their car, and I thought they were looking for someone else. And when they started approaching my car, I decided to get out just to explain to them that this is where I live. And when I stood up outside of my car, one of the officers pulled his gun, and he stood 10 feet away from me, and he said, "Move and I'll blow your brains out." And I had to put my hands up and say, "It's all right, it's okay, it's all right, it's okay." And I could see that officer holding that weapon with his hands shaking, and the other officer threw me on the back of the car, and they kept me out there for 20 minutes, and neighbors came out and started talking. And I couldn't persuade them that this is where I live. And after 20 minutes of humiliation and search, they recognized that I had done nothing wrong. They wouldn't apologize. They just said, we'll get you next time. I had to move from that neighborhood because I was never viewed the same way. And the weight of that experience wasn't just what happened to me. I started thinking about what I would have done if the same thing had happened 10 years earlier when I was 18, had not gone to law school, didn't know to say, it's all right, it's okay. And I worried that if the same thing had happened a decade earlier, I would have run when that officer pulled that gun. And I started worrying about the little kids in my community. Did they know not to run? And it creates a weight. It creates a kind of burden. And we have to change this burden. We have to eliminate and confront this risk. And that is why my work is now focused on creating an era of truth and justice in any society that has gone through horrific human rights violations. If you're trying to recover from a genocide, if you're trying to recover from slavery, if you're trying to recover from horrific human rights abuses, you have to have some plan for transitioning from a society where rights were violated to a society where rights will be vindicated. And what that means is that there has to be truth-telling. In South Africa, after apartheid, there was a commitment to truth-telling because people recognized that they could not recover from the tragedy of apartheid without some commitment to truth and reconciliation. In Rwanda, there's a recognition that there will not be recovery if there's not space for truth-telling. I've been to Berlin, Germany. When I go to Berlin, I'm struck by what I see in that city. You can't go 200 meters in Berlin without seeing markers and stones and symbols that have been placed to honor the victims of the Holocaust. The Holocaust Memorial sits in the center of the city. And when I traveled there, the taxi cab driver encouraged me to go, and the hotel operator encouraged me to go. And I was struck by the willingness to confront this legacy, this tragedy that took place in Europe during the middle of the 20th century. I was struck by the fact that in Berlin, I didn't see any Adolf Hitler statues. I couldn't find any ornaments honoring the architects of the Third Reich. I think in most parts of the nation, it would be unconscionable to suggest that we honor the perpetrators of the violence and the horrors of the Holocaust. But in my country, in the United States, I live in a region where the landscape is littered with iconography dedicated to honoring the architects and defenders of slavery. In my state of Alabama, Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday. Jefferson Davis, who led the effort to sustain and perpetuate slavery, his birthday is a state holiday. And this landscape has created an environment that is toxic for the kind of justice that I'm trying to achieve, both in the courts and outside the courts. And so for me, it is now necessary that we commit to truth-telling. And cultural institutions have the power to convey truth in ways that can be transformative. I've been to the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg. I went to that Holocaust Memorial and was very moved by what I saw there. Art has a critical role to play. Architecture has a critical role to play. We can create narrative spaces, and that's what we have been trying to do, and that's what motivated us to open our museum, the Legacy Museum, from enslavement to mass incarceration. There are Holocaust museums around the world, and when you go through these spaces, they tell a story. And at the end of these spaces, most of us are motivated to say, never again, to what we have just witnessed in that space. Well, we are trying to create narrative spaces that push people around the globe to recognize that never again can we tolerate the bigotry of racism. Never again can we accommodate the violence and injustice of racial hierarchy, of white supremacy. That is the genesis behind our museum. And then we also created the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. It's a cultural space where we honor thousands of victims of racial terror lynchings. We have these monuments that name the victims. And you get to a part in the monument where the monuments rise up above you so that people can appreciate what it was like to be taunted and tormented and traumatized by this violence. For me, truth-telling is essential to how we create a path forward. It is difficult in places like America, because unlike what happened in South Africa after apartheid collapsed and Black South Africans got the right to vote and became the majority of that country, there was a shift in power there. In Germany, Germany lost the war. There was a shift in power. We might not see what we see had the Nazis prevailed. In Rwanda, there was a shift in power. Military intervention meant that the victims of that horrific genocide were going to be protected. In my country, there hasn't been that shift in power. And so our work is complicated by the fact that we are trying to achieve this truth in era, this transitional justice, this new commitment to equality, without the shift in power that usually precipitates this kind of discourse. But we are persuaded, nonetheless, that we must do this. And because I am the heir of a generation of people who understood things about changing the narrative, I am persuaded we can do what must be done. And just two things before I close. I am persuaded that truth and justice is sequential. Truth and reconciliation, truth and reparation, truth and restoration. I think these things are sequential. We cannot talk about reconciliation. We cannot talk about reparation. We cannot talk about restoration and redemption until we first talk about the truth. And that is why we are so committed to detailing what the transatlantic slave trade represents, detailing how enslavement burdened communities and people. We have reports that we are putting on our website. We have videos. We're creating content. That's the reason why the museum and the memorial, for me, are critical tools in the truth-telling that then helps us get where we're trying to go. If we're going to recover from this pandemic, it's because our scientists become so intimately familiar with the COVID virus that they can make a diagnosis. They can tell us the truth about the way it works, and that truth will then make us comfortable with vaccines and treatments. You cannot get people to take chemotherapy and other horrific treatments for cancer until they have a diagnosis, and we haven't made that diagnosis, and so our work is very much organized around that. The second thing I am persuaded is that we cannot achieve this without being courageous and hopeful. For me, hope is essential to creating justice. I actually think that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. I think injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. If you go anywhere in the world where you see inequality and injustice, you will often see it sustained by a belief that things cannot change. I actually believe that hope is our superpower. Hope is the thing that gets you to stand up when others say sit down. It's the thing that gets you to speak when others say be quiet. It is essential that we be hopeful about the things that we can do. If we're actually going to create environments, we had to hope we could create a museum and a memorial, even though that was new for a bunch of lawyers like myself. But the second part of that is that we have to be courageous. I am persuaded we have to put ourselves in difficult and complicated situations. There is no path to justice that is completely comfortable and completely convenient. And I've learned something about that doing my work, and I'll end with this story. We have an exhibit of jars. They're jars of soil that we've asked people to go to lynching sites, places of great tragedy, and collect soil from the site and put it in a jar with the name of lynching victims and the date. And we did this in Alabama, and a few years ago, we had a middle-aged Black woman agree to do one of these soil collections, and she went to the site, and we give each person the jar and an implement to dig the soil and a memo. But her site was very remote, and it was very scary to her. And she parked her car and she found the site of the lynching, and she decided to start collecting the soil. But as soon as she got down on her knees to dig the soil, a truck drove by. And there was a big white guy in this truck, and he glared at her. And she got very nervous. And then the truck slowed down and turned around and drove back by her again. And the man stared some more, and she got even more anxious and worried. And then she saw this man park his truck and get out of his truck and start walking toward her. He was a very big guy. And we tell people when they collect soil that they don't have to explain what they're doing. We tell them, you can just say you're getting dirt. And that's what she decided to do because she was afraid of what this man was going to do. And sure enough, he walked up to her and he said, "What are you doing?" And this woman was about to explain. She was just getting dirt for her garden. But then she said, "Mr. Stevenson, something got a hold of me." And she said, "I found my courage." And I told that man, I said, "I'm digging soil because this is where a Black man was lynched in 1937, and I'm going to honor his life today." And she got nervous, so she started digging real fast, and the man just stood there. And then the man surprised her by asking her, he said, "Does that paper talk about the lynching?" She said, "It does." And then the man said, "Can I read it?" And she said, "Yes." And she gave the man the paper. And she was digging while the man read, and the man finished reading. He put the paper down, and then he stunned her by saying, do you think it would be okay if I helped you? And she said, yes. And she said, the man got down on his knees and she offered him the implement to dig the soil. He said, no, 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 you use it. I'll just use my hands. And then she said the man started throwing his hands into the soil and putting them in the jar and kept throwing his hands into the soil. And she said he was doing it with such conviction and such commitment that it moved her. And before she realized it, she had tears running down her face. And the man stopped. He said, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm upsetting you. And she said, no, 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 you're blessing me. And he kept digging with his hands and she kept digging with the implement, and they got toward the top of the jar and she noticed that the man had slowed down. And she looked at him and she could see his shoulders shaking. And then she saw a tear running down his face. And she stopped and she put her hand on his shoulder and she said, are you okay? And the man looked at her and he said, no, ma'am, I'm not okay. And then he said, I'm just so worried that it might have been my grandfather who participated in lynching this man. And she said they both sat there on the roadside with tears running down their faces. They finished and he said, I want to take a picture of you holding the jar. And she said, well, I want to take a picture of you holding the jar. And they took pictures of one another. And she said, I'm going back to Montgomery to put this in the museum. And he asked her if it would be okay if he came too. And both of these people came into our space to put this jar in our exhibit. And I tell you that not because I believe that beautiful things always happen when you tell the truth, always happen when you do the courageous things. They don't. But I am persuaded that we deny ourselves the beauty of justice when we allow ourselves to stay hopeless, when we don't do the courageous things that must be done to create justice and equality. And that is why I am so honored to be a part of this community. It's a community of people who are hopeful and courageous. And I want to call you to that same commitment to hope and courage, and invite you to visit us in Montgomery, Alabama, to see our spaces, to check out the resources that we have developed, but to mostly stand with all people all over the world that are trying to make equality and justice real and protect the human rights of every individual.
I think we all agree that Bryan Stevenson is a charismatic speaker, and if you want to know more about him and his work, I recommend his TED Talk and refer to the Right Livelihood Foundation's homepage as well, where you find a lot of material about all laureates of this and previous years. We end with some closing remarks from Anne Rüfer, President of Right Livelihood Foundation Switzerland and an endlessly enthusiastic member of the jury. Not unlike Bryan Stevenson, she can really force you to hope. The jury, consisting of board members and former laureates, does a great job every year and nominates the laureates from hundreds of candidates. I think the fact that there are so many proposals every year is in itself a sign of hope and points to the future.
After these impressive words, it is my great concern to make you, dear audience, aware once again that this prize is a distinction of civil society. This prize goes to committed people who live among us, like you and me. This is proven by the fact that each and every one of you can nominate someone for this prize. So also you. But we need you in another way, because this prize is real independent. And in the spirit of this independency, we are supported by many members of civil society. And therefore, I would like to ask you for your donation as well. Dear guests of the 13th Right Livelihood Award Lecture at Zurich University, let the bright words of Bryan Stevenson resonate within you. Draw your strength from the certainty that the 182 Right Livelihood laureates will not stop standing up for all of us. And help us, together with the laureates, to make our common world a world worth living in for everyone. To all of you, a heartfelt thank you.